The Pemberton branch of the Halifax Public Library smelled like old paper and radiator dust, which sounds unpleasant but had become, over 2 years of working there, one of the most comforting smells I knew. I was shelving returns on a Tuesday afternoon in late November when Geraldine, my manager, 63 years old and 4 months from retirement, found me in the 800s and said, with the particular flatness she reserved for things she'd rather not say, "They've confirmed it, the city's selling the building." I kept sliding books onto the shelf, Call of the Wild, The Stone Angel. I didn't know what else to do with my hands. When? End of March. Buyer's already been selected. She paused. A development firm. Harwick Group. I'd heard the name. Everyone in the neighborhood had. Harwick Group had already converted the old Founders Mill building into condos that started at $600,000. They'd bought the lot where the community hockey rink used to stand and put up a glass office tower that nobody seemed to work in. They were, by most accounts, the reason the words affordable and Halifax were increasingly difficult to use in the same sentence. "And us?" I asked. "We're being absorbed into the main branch on Spring Garden." She pulled a shelving cart closer as if she needed something to hold on to. "I know it's not. It's fine," I said, which was a lie so obvious she didn't bother acknowledging it. The Pemberton branch wasn't fine to lose. It was the only library within walking distance of 3 low-income apartment complexes. We had a Tuesday afternoon reading hour for kids whose parents worked doubles. We had Mr. Eng, who came every morning to use the computers, because he didn't have internet at home. We had the Somali family from the 3rd floor of the building across the street, whose youngest daughter had read every single book in our junior fiction section, and was now working her way through the YA shelves with a determination that made me feel like the world might be okay. The main branch was 3 bus transfers away. I drove home that night to my apartment in Spryfield, a 1-bedroom I shared with a cat named Biscuit, who belonged to the woman downstairs, but had never really internalized that fact. I sat on my couch and called my sister in Vancouver, and she said the kinds of things people say when they can't fix something. She said I'd find another position. She said I was good at what I did. She said there were other libraries. She wasn't wrong, but she wasn't right either. I was 26 years old. I had a library science degree, a student loan I'd be paying until I was 40, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from loving a job that the city doesn't think is worth funding. The Pemberton branch had been the thing I'd built my life around since graduating. The afternoon reading hours, the homework help program I'd started with 0 budget, and a donation box for school supplies. The quiet space I'd made for teenagers who had nowhere else to go after school. Losing it felt like losing a version of myself I'd worked very hard to become. The developer arrived on a Thursday. We knew he was coming because the city had sent a liaison to do a walkthrough, and the liaison had called ahead because she was the kind of person who believed in professional courtesy. Geraldine spent the morning making sure the shelves were organized and the computers were dusted, which felt both futile and necessary. I was in the middle of running the Tuesday reading hour, on a Thursday, because 2 of our regulars had dentist appointments Tuesday and I'd rescheduled, when the door opened and let in a gust of cold November air and 2 people. A woman in a tailored charcoal coat who moved like she ran things, and a man who came in behind her and paused just inside the doorway. I almost lost my place in the book. I was reading aloud to 6 kids arranged on the carpet in front of me, 4 of them from the apartment complex on Oland Crescent, 1 girl named Abby, who came alone every week and always sat in the same spot, and a boy named Marco, whose mother stood near the window with a coffee cup, half listening. I was reading The Trumpeter of Krakow, which was maybe ambitious for the age range, but they were into it. I had done a different voice for every character, which had gotten progressively undignified as the story went on, and at the moment the door opened, I was mid-sentence in the voice of a very pompous alchemist. The man near the door stopped walking. He was tall, broad-shouldered, mid-30s, wearing a dark coat that had the specific understated quality of clothing that cost more than I'd spent on furniture in my entire adult life. He had dark hair, sharp features, and the kind of face that looked like it had forgotten how to be at rest. But he wasn't looking at me the way most adults look at someone reading to children, with polite indifference, or the vague warmth of someone who finds the whole thing charming from a safe distance. He was actually listening, His head tilted slightly, his eyes, dark, focused, very still, tracked the words. I finished the chapter. The kids asked for one more. I said yes, because I always said yes, and read another. When I looked up at the end, the woman in the charcoal coat was talking quietly with Geraldine near the reference desk. The man was still standing where he'd stopped, and he was still watching. "Good story," said Abby, who said this every week regardless of what I'd read. "It really is," said a voice from across the room. Every adult head turned. The man had spoken quietly, but the library had the particular acoustics of high ceilings and old plaster, and his voice carried the way voices did in rooms that were built to hold silence. He looked at me directly then, and something about the steadiness of it made me want to look away. I didn't. "Lots more where that came from," I said, which was the dumbest thing I could have managed, but the kids laughed and the moment passed. Geraldine introduced him to me 20 minutes later, once the reading group had dispersed and Marco's mother had taken her coffee and her son back out into the cold. "This is Emmett Harwick," she said, with the tone of someone who was being extremely professional about something they found personally distasteful. "He's the principal at Harwick Group." "Of course he was." "Nolan Ward," I said, shaking his hand, because my name is on my employee badge and there was no point in the formal version. The handshake was firm, brief, and he held eye contact in a way that felt deliberate. "You work here," he said, not a question, observing. "I do. You were reading to those children. That's the reading hour. We run it twice a week." I paused. We ran it twice a week, past tense possibly becoming accurate in March. I don't know why I said it like that. I'm usually better at keeping my bitterness contained in professional settings. He looked at me without flinching. "I'm aware of the situation," he said. "Good," I said. "Then you don't need me to explain what gets lost when a neighborhood branch closes." Geraldine made a small noise that might have been a warning. Mr. Harwick didn't look bothered. He looked, if anything, like someone who had expected a different kind of conversation and found this one more interesting. "I don't," he said. "But I'd listen if you wanted to explain it anyway." I didn't know what to do with that, so I excused myself to reshelve returns. This was a lie. The returns were already shelved. I went to the back room and stood next to the photocopier, and told myself this was not my problem to solve, and he was not my problem to fix. He came back the following Tuesday. This time without the liaison, without anyone. He walked in, nodded at Geraldine, and went to the periodicals section with a newspaper. He read for an hour. He left. Geraldine told me this the next morning, with an expression I couldn't read. "He just read the paper?" "The Globe and the Chronicle Herald. He went through both." I filed this away under things that didn't make sense and tried not to think about it. He came back Thursday. I had the reading hour and I was, by then, reading My Side of the Mountain, which is about a boy who runs away to the Catskills and lives in a hollowed-out tree. He came in halfway through. He sat in one of the adult chairs at the edge of the children's area, at a table with a book he didn't open, and he listened. I noticed because I notice everything when I'm reading aloud. You have to. You watch the faces, you adjust your pace. You learn which parts make Abby lean forward, and which parts make Marco start to fidget. He didn't fidget. Afterward, when the kids had gone, I brought him a cup of tea from our small staff kitchen without thinking about whether that was appropriate. He looked at the mug, chipped, library branded, featuring a cartoon owl that had seen better days, with something that took me a moment to identify as amusement. "This is very kind," he said. "It's just tea. We have a kettle in the back." I set it down. "You came back." "I did. Most people tour a property once. I'm not here about the property today." He picked up the mug, and I noticed his hands, the hands of someone who worked or had worked at some point with them. A small scar across 2 knuckles. I wanted to hear the end of the chapter. I sat down across from him, which I hadn't planned. "It's a long book, I know." I read it as a kid. He looked up. "I grew up in Dartmouth. We had a library like this one. Smaller, but the same feeling. You could spend a whole Saturday afternoon and nobody asked you to buy anything or be anywhere." This was not what I'd expected Emmett Harwick to say. "What happened to it?" I asked. "Closed. About 12 years ago. Budget cuts." He set the mug down. "I know what you think of me, Miss Ward. I've heard the objections to what we build. They're not inaccurate. But I'm not sure the situation is as simple as you think it is either." I wanted to say that losing the Pemberton branch felt pretty simple from where I stood. I said instead. Then explain it to me. He did. For 40 minutes, over cooling tea, he explained the financing structures behind the development, the city's deficit, the grants that were contingent on tax revenue from new commercial development, the affordable housing units that were part of the Harwick deal, not as a concession but as a required component, 30% below market rate, which was more than the city's usual requirement of 15%. The community partnership fund that was written into every major project. It wasn't the story I'd been telling myself. It wasn't exactly the story he was telling me, either. I was skeptical enough to know that men with money tend to narrate their own choices charitably. But it was more complicated than Villain buys neighborhood library, full stop. What happens to the collection? I asked. The books. That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a card. Not today. When you have time. There's a possibility I'd like to walk you through. I looked at the card. Emmett Harwick, Principal. Harwick Group. The cardstock was the particular kind of thick that you only notice when you're used to paper that isn't. I'm busy most days, I said. Most days, he said. Not all. I called him 4 days later. I don't know what made me do it on day 4 instead of day 3 or day 10. Maybe I was tired of making the same argument to walls and wanted to try making it to someone who might actually be able to do something. We met at a coffee shop on Quinpool. Not one of the expensive ones, just the kind of place that's been in the same location for 15 years and probably makes just enough to stay there. He got there first and had already ordered dark roast black, and when I arrived and ordered the same, he looked at me with something that might have been approval, though I may have imagined that. He told me about the development plans. The Pemberton site would be a mixed-use building. Residential on floors 2 through 9, commercial on the ground floor. The commercial space was currently unassigned. He was considering options. One of those options, he said carefully, is a community hub. Shared space. Could include a reading room. Programming space. He paused. Not a library. The Halifax system wouldn't fund a satellite location, but something adjacent to it. I stared at him. You're suggesting a private community reading room. I'm suggesting a space that you could design and run, with a programming budget. Staff funded through the Community Partnership Fund for the first 3 years. Why? He looked at me directly, and I'd been around him enough times by then to know this was not a habitual thing for him. He was usually slightly sideways with his attention, watching without being watched, the way people get when they're used to being the person with the most to lose in a room. Looking straight at someone was something he chose. Because what you do in that library is worth preserving, he said. I watched you read to those kids, and I watched their faces, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. He looked down at his coffee. I've been in a lot of rooms in my life where people want things from me. Very few of them have been rooms where something was being given, without anyone expecting anything back. I'd forgotten what that looked like. I didn't know what to say. This was unusual. I generally know what to say. This is a business proposition, I finally managed. Not, this is professional. Yes, no hesitation. But I'd also like to have coffee with you again, if that's something you'd be open to, professionally and otherwise. I told him I'd think about it. He nodded, like someone who'd been told that before and knew it wasn't always a no. I took the job. Formally, 3 weeks after that meeting in the coffee shop on Quinpool, with a contract that a friend from law school looked over and said was, to her considerable surprise, entirely reasonable. My title was Community Programming Director, which felt very large for someone who had spent 2 years doing it for essentially free with a budget of 0. The Pemberton branch closed at the end of March on a gray Wednesday. Geraldine cried, which she'd said she wasn't going to do, and I cried, which I also hadn't planned. Mr. Ng shook my hand very formally and said he hoped things worked out. Abby gave me a drawing she'd done of the owl on our library mug. I kept working in the Harwick building in the months that followed, in a temporary office on the 4th floor of their downtown location, while the Pemberton site was being redeveloped. I was in and out of meetings with architects and contractors and a city cultural liaison named Doug, who had opinions about everything and authority over very little. I saw Emmett regularly. Professionally at first, he was involved in the community space design in a level of detail that surprised me. He had opinions about the acoustics and the natural light and the arrangement of the shelving. He'd done research. He had at some point, between our first meeting and the design phase, read 6 books about library design, which he mentioned once, offhandedly, and which I was not supposed to find as affecting as I did. We had coffee twice more, not professionally. He was different outside of work. Still contained, still watching more than he said, but occasionally something broke through it. He made dry, deadpan observations about things that made me laugh harder than they probably warranted. He asked questions that were genuinely curious rather than performatively interested. He listened in the complete way that very few people do, the way that makes you feel like you're not fighting for space in the conversation. I was careful. He was my employer, functionally. There was a power differential that I was not going to pretend didn't exist. I kept my distance in the specific way you keep distance from something you're trying not to want. He kept the distance too. I noticed, because I noticed things. The first indication that something was wrong came on a Thursday evening in August. I was locking up the temporary office. We'd been given space in the downtown building, and I was usually the last one out, when a man I didn't recognize was waiting by the elevator. He was large, unhurried, and looked at me the way people look at things they're calculating the value of. "You're Nolan Ward," he said. Not a question. "Who's asking?" He smiled with his mouth only. "Tell Harwick that Vachon wants his answer. He knows the question." I took the stairs. I don't entirely know why. Some instinct that wanted movement. I called Emmett from the parking garage, standing under the fluorescent lights with my keys in my hand, and he picked up on the second ring, and I heard the shift in his voice when I told him what had happened. "Are you in your car?" "Not yet." "Get in your car. Lock the doors. I'll be there in 10 minutes. "Emmett, please." That word from him was unusual enough that I listened. He arrived in 8 minutes with a driver I'd never seen, a woman who spoke very few words and moved with an alertness that suggested she'd been hired for more than navigation. He walked me up to my apartment. We'd started having dinner occasionally, so he'd been there before, and knew which buzzer worked, and we sat at my kitchen table and he said, "I need to tell you something," he told me. Not all of it that night, but enough. Emmett Harwick had not always been Emmett Harwick in the way he was now. He'd grown up in Dartmouth without money, had been smart enough and stubborn enough to claw a path out. But the early funding for his first projects had come from men whose money didn't ask too many questions. He'd used those loans, he'd built with them. He'd repaid every cent and then spent the following decade trying to build something that bore no resemblance to those early arrangements. Vachon was one of the men from that time. He ran what could charitably be called a private investment group and was specifically, according to the RCMP file that Emmett produced from his bag with the matter-of-fact, calm of someone who'd been expecting this day, a person of significant interest in 2 active investigations. "He wants you to do something," I said. "He wants a favor in return for not making my history with him public, which would, depending on how it's framed, be sufficiently damaging to kill several of our development projects and potentially end the company." "What kind of favor?" Emmett was quiet for a moment. "He wants access to a city councilor I have a relationship with. Not to do anything violent, he wants information that councilor has about a rezoning decision." "That's still." "I know what it is." He looked at me steadily. "I'm telling you because you were approached, and because you deserve to know what you're in proximity to." I sat with that for a long time. The apartment was quiet except for Biscuit scratching at the door, which was her way of announcing she'd had enough of downstairs. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I don't know yet." The honesty in that was its own kind of answer. I've made enough choices in my life that I regret. I don't want to make another one, but the consequences of refusing are significant for the projects, the housing units, the community space, and for my company, and for everyone who works for me. He ran a hand through his hair. "I'm not asking you what to do. I'm not asking you to be part of this. I just needed you to know." I said very little that night, and when he left, I stood at the window for a long time watching the street below. I did something I told myself I wasn't going to do. I looked him up, properly, beyond the business profile I'd already read, not to find ammunition, to understand. I found the RCMP advisory. I found 3 profiles in the Globe and the National Post, one of which mentioned early investors in terms carefully calibrated to imply without stating. I found the community impact reports from every major Harwick project over the past 7 years. The affordable units, the childcare spaces, the partnership with Immigrant Services Nova Scotia that had created 42 permanent positions. I found an op-ed he'd written for the Chronicle Herald 2 years ago about the relationship between development and displacement, which was more self-aware than I'd expected, and more critical of his own industry than was comfortable to read. He was not a simple person. I had known this, but the reading made it concrete. I called him the next morning. What happens if you go to the RCMP yourself? A long pause. I face consequences for the original arrangements, potentially significant ones. It would depend on what they choose to pursue, what consequences, fines, possible charges, though my lawyer believes the statute of limitations has run on most of it. Loss of the company's standing with the city for a period of time that would effectively end the current development cycle, and the community space, the Pemberton project, likely on hold for 2 to 3 years, possibly longer. I thought about Mr. Ng, who had started coming to the reading room at the temporary location twice a week. I thought about Abby, who had started a reading journal she showed me sometimes. I thought about the 30% affordable housing units, and the programming budget, and what it had felt like to have the thing I'd built actually be supported instead of treated like a budget line to cut. And then I thought about what it would mean to help Emmett stay quiet. To be in proximity to a choice that was wrong in order to protect things that were right. The weight of that particular compromise. I can't tell you what to do, I said, but I can tell you what I can be part of and what I can't. I know I can't be with someone who chooses this kind of out. Not because I don't understand the cost, but because I know what you're trying to build, and I think you do too, and I don't believe the foundation holds if this is in it. The silence was long enough that I thought I might have said the thing that ended it. Then he said, I made an appointment with a lawyer this morning. Not my corporate counsel, a criminal defense attorney. I wanted to know where I actually stood before I decided anything. I breathed. I'm not ready to tell you it's going to be fine, he said. I don't know that it will be. I know, but I'm not going to call Vashon. What followed was the least cinematic version of events imaginable, which is probably how real things tend to go. Emmett worked with his lawyer for 6 weeks, quietly, before approaching the RCMP. He provided them with documentation on Vashon and 2 associates, and they were, apparently, very interested. His own liability was assessed and reassessed, and in the end, he faced a financial penalty of approximately $400,000. Enormous by any ordinary measure, a fraction of what Harwick Group was worth, and a 12-month period of increased regulatory oversight on all new city contracts. There were no charges. The criminal defense attorney had been right about the statute of limitations. There was a week of coverage in the local papers that was uncomfortable and not inaccurate, and then the story was absorbed into the general noise of the news cycle and receded. Vashon was arrested in early February. I read about it in the Chronicle Herald while eating toast in my apartment, biscuit arranged across my feet with the purposeful weight of a cat who believes this is load-bearing. The Pemberton project continued, delayed by 4 months due to the regulatory review, but continued. I'd like to say that Emmett and I talked through everything calmly and arrived at clarity in a dignified manner. Mostly what happened is that I brought him dinner one night, when I knew he was still at the office at 9 o'clock, because I had been raised in a family where bringing someone food was how you said things that were hard to say out loud. He opened the door to his office and looked at me holding 2 containers of takeout pho from the place on Agricola, and something in his face changed in the way that faces do when people have been holding too much for too long, and something finally relaxes. We sat on the floor of his office because the conference table was covered in documents, and neither of us felt like clearing it. He said at some point that he hadn't expected any of this, not the regulatory mess, not the RCMP conversation, and not me. What do you mean, not me? He looked at me sideways. He had, I'd noticed, a way of going sideways when he was about to say something he meant, as if direct eye contact was reserved for things that required armor. You read my side of the mountain to 6 children in a library that was 2 months from closing, he said. And you did it like it was the most important thing happening in the city that day. And I stood in the doorway and I thought, I couldn't remember the last time I'd been in a room where the only thing anyone was trying to get was the next chapter. He was quiet for a moment. I've built things, he said, a lot of things. And I've told myself they were worth it. The compromises, the choices, the early years when I wasn't always the person I wanted to be. But watching you in that library, I thought maybe the thing that was actually worth building was something I'd stopped knowing how to recognize. I thought about what to say for long enough that it probably became obvious I was thinking. You recognized it, though, I said finally. That's why you came back. He turned and looked at me directly this time, the armor apparently having been located. Gull, he said. What? I want to call you something that isn't your name. I don't know why. You remind me of a seagull, not in a bad way, in the way they don't apologize for existing in spaces people have decided they're not supposed to occupy. I stared at him. That is the strangest thing anyone has ever said to me, I said. I know. He looked genuinely unsettled by himself. Forget I said it. I'm not going to forget you said it. I know that too. I was laughing by then, which was not where I'd expected the evening to go, and he was almost laughing, which was the closest he got to it in those months, and the distance that I'd been keeping. Carefully, deliberately, with both hands. It had been closing for a long time before that night, and I had known it and kept maintaining it anyway. You can only hold that kind of distance for so long before it costs more than closing it would. Emmett, I said. Yes, I'm going to need you to be honest with me. Always. Not selectively. Not when it's convenient. I know, and I need you to understand that I'm going to keep doing the work. The reading hours and the homework help and the programming. That's not going to become secondary to your schedule or your optics, or what works for the company. I know that too, and if you call me Gull in public, I will absolutely deny we've ever met. He was quiet for a moment, and then he did something I hadn't seen before. He smiled, fully, without qualification, the kind of expression that doesn't know how to be strategic because it arrived before strategy could catch up. It changed his whole face. Deal, he said. The Pemberton Community Reading Room opened on a Thursday, in September, 13 months after the branch had closed. I'd been involved in every decision: the layout, the collection, the programming, the after-school hours, the accessibility features, the community board that included representation from all 3 apartment complexes on Oland Crescent. We didn't call it a library because the Halifax system had specific feelings about nomenclature and funding. We called it what it was: a place to read. We had soft seating and proper lighting, and a back corner with carpet squares and beanbag chairs that was officially called the Story Corner, and was already, on opening day, occupied by Abby and 3 other children with their shoes off. Emmett came and stood near the back and didn't say much, which was his way. Geraldine flew in from Victoria for it and cried again, and this time I was prepared, so I had tissues. Mr. Ing claimed the same chair by the window he'd used in the old building, as if the chair had somehow migrated and he'd simply located it. His granddaughter, who was visiting from Calgary, asked if she could take out a card. I was signing her up when I looked across the room and saw Emmett watching me with the expression I'd come to know. That specific stillness that wasn't emptiness, but presence. A person genuinely paying attention. And I remembered standing in a library 2 years ago, holding books I was shelving toward the end, and thinking that what I'd built was going to disappear, and taking nothing from the world with it. I thought about how wrong I'd been, about what disappears and what stays. After the last visitor left that night, and it was just us locking up, he held the door while I set the alarm, and when I came out into the cool September air, he was already standing on the sidewalk looking up at the building. The reading room windows glowed warm from the inside. Whoever had last left the story corner had left the corner lamp on, which I'd normally go back and fix, but I didn't. Well, I said, coming to stand next to him. He looked down at me. Well, you know this is going to need a bigger collection within 6 months. The current budget doesn't cover it, I know, and the after-school program is going to need another staff person by spring if the numbers hold. I've already asked the foundation to look at that. I nodded. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block a car alarm started and then thought better of it. Gull, he said. We're in public. The street is empty. Emmett. He said it again quietly. Just my name and his voice in the dark on a September street outside a reading room that had existed a year ago, and I stopped pretending I didn't know exactly what it meant and what it had meant for a long time. Some accidents, I thought, looking up at those lit windows. The warmth of them against the dark are just the shape that arriving looks like, from the outside, before you understand you were always on your way.